I heard them decide my fate through a door that was not fully closed. The words, sharp and clear as slivers of glass, slid under the heavy oak and found me where I waited in the hall, a ghost in grey wool. "Seat her near the servants' entrance," my cousin Beatrice said, her voice possessing the brittle, musical quality of a harpsichord played slightly too hard. "It is draughty, but she is hardly delicate, and for heaven's sake, tell cook not to offer her the best cuts of the roast. She has a country appetite." A murmur of agreement came from my Aunt Augusta, a sound like dry leaves skittering across flagstones. It was not cruelty, not in their estimation. It was merely practical. I was a fixture, a piece of necessary but unlovely furniture, to be positioned where it would cause the least offence to the eye. I did not move. I stood with my hands clasped, my worn gloves hiding the small ink stain on my index finger, and I listened to the architecture of my own insignificance being constructed in the next room. I was Eleonora, the plain cousin, the poor relation brought to their London house for the season. Not for my own sake, of course. My purpose was to be the drab shadow that made my younger sister Amelia appear all the more luminous. Amelia, with her sunshine hair and laughter like wind chimes, was the family's great hope. She was the commodity we were to sell to the highest bidder, and my presence was part of the packaging, a quiet, sensible chaperone who would lend an air of propriety to the entire desperate venture. My father, a man whose affections were as mild and ineffectual as a winter sun, had agreed to it all with a sigh of relief. He was a scholar of forgotten histories, far more comfortable with dusty treaties than with the ledgers that bled red ink, detailing the slow collapse of our small country estate. So here I was, a silent witness to my own effacement. I was too quiet, too fond of books, and had been cursed with a face that was merely composed. It was a face that promised no drama, no soaring passion, only a placid and unremarkable continuity. In a world that valued ornamentation, I was plain, solid oak, and they craved gilded filigree. The catalyst for this particular evening, this grand dinner party that glittered and hummed on the other side of the door, was the rumoured attendance of a true prize, a figure of almost mythical stature in the marriage market. The Duke of Blackwood. His name was spoken in hushed, avaricious tones throughout the drawing-rooms of Mayfair. He was impossibly wealthy, possessor of a title that stretched back to the Conquest, and, most tragically, and therefore most enticingly, a widower. His grief was legendary. They said he had loved his first Duchess with a poet's devotion, and that her death in childbirth 5 years prior had hollowed him out, leaving behind a man of severe silences and impenetrable sorrow. He had not been seen in society since, sequestering himself in the cold grandeur of his northern estate. His sudden re-emergence had sent a shockwave through every ambitious matriarch in London. He was the wounded prince, and 100 eager young ladies were being groomed to play the part of the healer who would mend his broken heart and, not incidentally, secure his title and fortune. Amelia, my aunt had decided, was destined for the role. When the summons finally came, I entered the drawing-room with the practised invisibility I had perfected over a lifetime. I kept my eyes lowered, my posture unobtrusive, my smile a faint, polite sketch. The room was a cacophony of shimmering silk, flashing jewels, and the high, sharp sound of competitive laughter. I saw Amelia, a vision in pale rose satin, already holding a small court of admirers. My aunt nodded at me, a curt, dismissive gesture that directed me toward the far end of the room, and I obeyed. I found my assigned place, a small, hard-backed chair tucked into an alcove near the heavy velvet curtains that masked the corridor to the kitchens. Beatrice was right. It was draughty. A persistent, cool whisper of air snaked around my ankles. Then he arrived. The room did not fall silent, but the quality of the sound within it changed. The chatter became thinner, more strained, as if every person had unconsciously held a part of their breath. The Duke of Blackwood was not a handsome man in the classical sense. His features were too stark, his jaw too unforgiving, his brow too severe. He was tall and moved with an economy of motion that suggested immense, contained power. Dressed in unrelenting black, he seemed to absorb the candlelight rather than reflect it, a figure of shadow and substance in a room of glittering ephemera. He carried with him an aura of profound stillness, an almost physical weight of sorrow that made the frivolous gaiety of the party seem cheap and thin. He greeted my aunt with a brief, formal bow, his face a mask of polite indifference. Dinner was announced. The slow, ponderous migration began, a rustling river of silk and broadcloth flowing toward the dining room. I rose and waited, as was my custom, for the main procession to pass. I was to be the last drop in that river, the bit of flotsam that trailed in the wake. As the guests found their jewel-toned place cards, I saw the seat intended for me. It was precisely as Beatrice had ordered, at the very end of the long polished table, beside an empty chair that would buffer me from the first of the footmen entering with the soup. From this vantage point, I would have a perfect view of the server's elbows and the back of a minor baronet's head. I was making my way toward it when the low, clear voice of my cousin sliced through the general murmur. She had not seen that the Duke was standing near her, momentarily delayed by some pleasantry from my aunt. "Oh, the footman seems to have forgotten a setting," Beatrice said, her voice pitched for performance, a light confection of feigned concern. She gestured vaguely in my direction. No, that is for my cousin Eleonora. Just there is fine. Seat her near the servants." The words hung in the air, naked and cruel. A few people heard. I saw the flicker of a smirk on one lady's face, the hasty, averted glance of another. I felt a familiar hot flush creep up my neck, the deep internal shame of being publicly designated as worthless. I froze, caught in the terrible spotlight of her casual disdain. I expected the moment to pass, as such moments always did, absorbed into the general hum of the evening, leaving me with only the lingering sting. But it did not pass, because the Duke of Blackwood stood and moved. It was not a grand gesture, it was a simple, deliberate act. He turned away from my aunt, who was mid-sentence, and walked the length of the table. He did not look at Beatrice. He did not look at anyone. His gaze was fixed on the small, desolate chair at the foot of the table. He walked past the gleaming silver, the crystal glasses, the anxious, hopeful faces of the unmarried daughters. He stopped beside me. For a terrifying second, I thought he meant to reprimand me for causing a disruption. He did not. He looked at me, truly looked at me, and for the first time in my life, I felt the full, undivided attention of another human being. It was not a glance, not the polite sweep of a gentleman's assessment, but a direct, penetrating gaze that seemed to bypass my grey dress and my plain face and see something deeper inside. His eyes were a startlingly clear grey, the colour of a winter sea, and they held not pity, but a kind of weary recognition. Then he inclined his head, a gesture of profound and unexpected courtesy. "Miss Eleonora," he said, his voice a low resonance that seemed to vibrate in the very air between us. "They have made a mistake. Your seat is here." And he gestured not to the chair beside him at the head of the table, the seat of honour that had been prepared for him beside the hostess, but to his own. He pulled it out with a quiet scrape against the parquet floor, a sound that echoed like a cannon shot in the suddenly silent room. He stood there, the Duke of Blackwood, holding a chair for me, the invisible cousin, and waited. It was an act of rebellion so quiet, so exquisitely polite, that it was more devastating than any shouted insult. He had not merely offered me a seat, he had offered me his own, and in doing so, he had dismantled the entire social hierarchy of the room with a single, graceful movement. I could do nothing but walk toward him, my legs feeling strangely disconnected from my body, and allow myself to be seated as if I were a queen. He then took the empty chair beside me, the one intended as a buffer from the servants, and settled into it as if it were a throne. The dinner that followed was the strangest and most unnerving meal of my life. I was aware of the furious, disbelieving eyes of my aunt and cousin fixed upon me, but I could not bring myself to look at them. All my senses were focused on the man beside me, a dark, silent planet who had inexplicably altered my orbit. In the days that followed, the Duke's silent rebellion became a quiet campaign. He did not court me, not in any conventional sense. He simply appeared. He found me in my aunt's rarely used library, a place that had been my only sanctuary, its dusty silence a balm to my frayed nerves. I was perched on a ladder, reaching for a volume of Tacitus, when his voice came from the doorway. An excellent choice. His analysis of power is as relevant today as it was 2 millennia ago. I nearly fell. He did not smile, but the severity of his expression seemed to soften around the edges as he took the heavy book from my hands. We spoke for an hour that morning, standing between the towering shelves. We did not speak of the weather or of society gossip. We spoke of history, of philosophy, of agricultural reforms he was implementing on his northern lands. I forgot to be timid. I forgot that I was the plain, penniless cousin, and he was a duke. I was simply a mind engaging with another, and it was the most exhilarating experience of my life. He listened to my opinions, not with polite indulgence, but with a focused intensity that made me feel as though my words had weight and value. He sought me out again the next day, and the next. He would find me walking in the gardens, and we would pace the gravel paths, our conversation picking up precisely where it had left off. My aunt and Beatrice were apoplectic. Amelia was merely confused, her pretty face puckered in a frown as she watched the greatest prize of the season ignore her completely in favour of her drab older sister. My aunt, furious at this disruption of her plans, retaliated in the only way she knew how. She made my life smaller, colder. I was moved from my small but tolerable room in the main house to a derelict gardener's cottage at the far end of the estate. It was ostensibly to give me peace and quiet for my scholarly pursuits, a phrase she uttered with a sneer, but the reality was a punishment. The cottage was damp, the hearth smoked, and the wind howled through the ill-fitting window frames. I was isolated, meant to feel the full force of her displeasure. I spent my evenings huddled in a thin blanket, reading by the light of a single guttering candle, the cold seeping into my bones. One afternoon, a cart rumbled up the muddy track to the cottage. An old man, a tenant farmer I did not recognise, unloaded a staggering quantity of dry, seasoned firewood and stacked it neatly by my door. When I went out to question him, he simply touched his cap and said, "A gift, miss, from a friend." Before I could press him, he was gone. That evening, as a brilliant, smokeless fire blazed in the hearth for the first time, I found something else had been delivered. Left on my doorstep was a heavy parcel wrapped in plain brown paper. Inside was a shawl of the finest, softest wool I had ever touched, the colour of deep heather. It was impossibly warm. Tucked into its folds was a small, exquisitely carved wooden horse, no bigger than my palm, its lines simple and fluid, polished to a soft gleam. There was no note. There did not need to be one. I held the small horse in my hand, its smooth, cool weight a comfort against my skin. And I knew. It was not a grand, romantic gesture. It was something far more intimate. It was a secret kindness, a quiet declaration that he saw my discomfort and had moved to alleviate it. He had noticed. Our meetings in the library grew more frequent. We fell into a comfortable routine, a shared world of quiet discovery among the books. One rainy afternoon, we were both standing before a high shelf, discussing a passage in a book of poetry. "I believe the volume you mentioned is just there," I said, pointing to a slim, leather-bound book on the top shelf. We both reached for it at the same time. As his hand closed over the spine, his fingers brushed against mine. It was the briefest of touches, a fleeting contact of skin against skin, yet a jolt, sharp and electric, shot through me. I snatched my hand back, as if burned. He froze, the book held midway between the shelf and his body. The air in the small space between us grew thick and heavy, charged with a sudden, unspoken tension. He did not apologize or make light of the moment. He simply held my gaze, his own eyes dark and unreadable, and I felt that the world had narrowed to this single point, to the space of a few inches that separated his hand from mine. The quiet hum of the rain against the tall library windows was the only sound. He finally lowered the book, his movements slow and deliberate. He did not offer it to me. Instead, he held it, his thumb stroking the worn leather of the cover. "Eleonora," he said, and the sound of my given name, spoken in his low voice without the formal prefix, was a seismic event. It was a breach of etiquette so profound, so intimate, that it felt more scandalous than a kiss. "I find I am tired of the city. I return to Blackwood at the end of the week. I would be honoured if you would permit me to write to you." He did not ask if my aunt would permit it. He did not ask if it was proper. He asked me. It was a question directed at my will, my desire. "Yes, Alistair," I heard myself whisper, and the sound of his name on my own lips was both a terror and a homecoming. That night, my world, which had begun to feel so full of nascent hope, shattered. Searching for a spare candle in the desk of my aunt's study, where I had been summoned to copy out letters for her, my hand brushed against a sheaf of papers tucked into a pigeonhole. A familiar crest caught my eye. My own family's. Curiosity, a trait I seldom indulged, got the better of me. I drew the papers out. It was a letter from my aunt to my father, dated from the month before our arrival in London. My eyes scanned the spidery, aggressive script, and the words began to swim before me. The debt is now quite beyond our means. Blackwood is a man of business, and his patience is at an end. Our only hope is Amelia. A match would settle the matter entirely. His estate holds the deeds to half of your land as collateral. The air left my lungs in a painful rush. Debt. The word was a cold, hard stone in my stomach. Our family was not merely struggling. We were ruined. And we were ruined at the hands of the Duke of Blackwood. His estate. His business. The foundation of my fragile new world crumbled into dust. Every kindness, every shared conversation, every thoughtful gesture was instantly recontextualized into something ugly and manipulative. His attention to me, was it a strategy? A way to gain leverage over my family, to toy with the plain cousin while his true target was the pretty one? The warmth of the heather-coloured shawl felt like a brand of shame against my skin. The little wooden horse in my pocket felt heavy as lead. He was not a saviour. He was the architect of our ruin. The kindness was not a gift. It came with an invisible invoice of devastating proportions. I did not sleep. I sat before my fire, the flames he had provided for me, and I stared into them until my eyes burned. By morning, a cold, hard resolve had settled in my heart. I would not be a pawn in his game, nor in my aunt's. I requested an audience with him, sending a note with a stable boy, asking him to meet me in the gardens, in the one place that had felt like neutral ground. He was waiting for me by the stone sundial, his tall frame stark against the pale morning sky. He looked at my face, and the faint, polite smile on his own vanished. "Eleonora, what is it?" I did not waste time with pleasantries. I held out the letter. "I believe this belongs to you," I said, my voice thin and brittle. "Or rather, the subject matter does." He took the paper, his brow furrowing as he read. He showed no surprise, no guilt. He simply folded it carefully and looked back at me, his expression unreadable. "I see. Do you?" The question was sharper than I intended. "Do you see that every moment we have spent together has been built upon a lie? You knew my family was at your mercy, that we were here under false pretenses, desperately trying to sell my sister to you to settle a debt." The words tumbled out, fueled by a night of pain and disillusionment. Was I an amusing diversion, a novel way to pass the time while you assessed the value of your potential acquisition? Was your kindness merely a tool of negotiation? He remained silent for a long moment, his gaze never leaving my face. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, devoid of artifice. "Yes," he said, "I knew of the debt before I ever set foot in your aunt's house. My initial purpose in accepting her invitation was precisely what you suspect. To take the measure of the family that owed my estate such a significant sum. The admission was a physical blow. I flinched, wrapping my arms around myself. But that, he continued, taking a step closer, was before I saw you. Before I saw them try to hide you in a corner. Before I heard a woman with a mind like a diamond being spoken of as if she were a piece of inconvenient luggage. He paused, and his next words were low and intense. Everything else was a catastrophe I did not plan for. He took another step, closing the distance between us until I had to tilt my head back to look at him. You, Eleonora. You were the catastrophe. I stared at him, my anger and hurt warring with the undeniable sincerity in his voice. I do not understand, I whispered. I have spent 5 years in a grey wasteland, he said, his voice raw with an emotion I had never heard from him before. My life was a matter of duty, of managing estates and ledgers, of honouring a memory. There was no colour, no light. And then I saw you, in your plain grey dress, and you were not performing. You were not simpering or flirting or trying to be anything other than what you were. You were still. You were real. And in that moment, the world was no longer grey. He reached out, not to touch me, but holding his hand in the space between us, as if to prove he would not force any contact. The debt is a legal matter. It is meaningless. 2 weeks ago, I instructed my solicitor to redraft the terms, to remove the deeds to your father's land as collateral, and extend the repayment indefinitely, at no interest. I did it not for your family, but for you, to free you from them, so that any choice you made would be your own, unburdened by their desperation. He had already acted. He had defended me before I even knew I was under attack. The sheer proactive honour of it undid me. The rigid wall I had built around my heart began to crumble. I came to London to conduct business, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. A dry, financial affair. I did not expect to find the one thing I had given up all hope of ever finding again. A home. Your mind is a home, Eleonora. Your quiet strength is a harbour. I find myself unmade by you. I am asking you not to settle a debt, but to save a man from the ghost he has become. I am asking you to be my wife. The vulnerable confession hung between us, as real and tangible as the cool morning air. This severe, guarded man had laid his soul bare before me. He had seen me, not just my surface, but the very core of my being, and he had valued it. He had valued me. The hope I had thought extinguished reignited, burning brighter and warmer than ever before. Yes, I said, the word a quiet breath of acceptance, of reciprocation. Yes, Alistair. And in that moment, our alliance was forged, not on contracts or ledgers, but on a foundation of mutual recognition and profound, unexpected love. The news of our impending engagement sent my aunt's household into a state of barely controlled hysteria. Aunt Augusta and Beatrice viewed my happiness not as a fortunate turn of events, but as a personal and deeply offensive betrayal. Their final, desperate gambit came at the annual Blackwood Ball, an event my aunt had angled for an invitation to for years, and which we now attended as the Duke's honoured guests. The ballroom was a dizzying kaleidoscope of light and sound, but I felt a strange calm, anchored by Alistair's presence at my side. The confrontation, when it came, was as public and vicious as they could make it. In a lull between dances, my aunt, her face a mask of righteous fury, stepped into the centre of the room. "Your Grace," she announced, her voice carrying across the polished floor. "I must protest this travesty. This engagement cannot stand. My niece," she pointed a trembling jewelled finger at me, "is a manipulative fortune hunter. She has preyed upon your grief, trapping you with her false piety and cunning ways. She has insinuated herself into your life through deception." Beatrice stood just behind her, her expression one of vindicated malice. A shocked silence fell over the glittering assembly. All eyes turned to me. In the past, such an accusation would have shattered me, sent me fleeing in shame and humiliation. But I was not the same woman who had stood silently in a draughty hallway. I looked at my aunt, at the ugly twist of her mouth, and I felt not fear, but a profound and weary pity. Before Alistair could speak, I took a step forward. My voice, when I spoke, was not loud, but it was clear and steady, and it carried to every corner of the room. "My only cunning," I said, meeting my aunt's furious gaze, "was to read books. My only deception was to have opinions. My only crime, it seems, was to be seen by a man of intelligence and character as a person, rather than as a pawn to be moved about a board." I turned my gaze from her to the assembled guests. For years, I was told my worth was negligible because I was not a great beauty. I was treated as an inconvenience because I did not possess a fortune. I have learned, through the grace of a good man, that my worth is not determined by the reflection in a mirror or the numbers in a ledger. It resides in my mind and in my heart. And I will not allow anyone, ever again, to tell me that is not enough. A murmur went through the crowd, a subtle shift from shock to something else. Respect. My quiet empowerment had resonated more deeply than my aunt's shrill accusations. Just then, my sister Amelia, who had been standing with a group of her friends, her face pale, walked slowly across the floor and came to stand beside me. She did not speak, but she took my hand, a small public gesture of solidarity that spoke volumes. It was her own quiet rebellion, her own declaration of independence. Then Alistair moved to my side, placing a hand at the small of my back. He did not look at my aunt. He addressed the room at large, his voice calm and resonant with authority. "As some of you may be aware," he began, "Miss Eleanora's family was under a certain financial obligation to my estate." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "An obligation which I have personally seen fit to forgive." He produced a folded document from his coat, the new debt agreement. "Furthermore, I have found in Miss Eleanora a woman of such profound integrity, intelligence, and grace that I consider myself the most fortunate of men. Her character is a treasure rarer than any title or fortune in this room. Our engagement stands, and I will consider any further insult to my future Duchess as a direct and personal affront to myself. The defeat of my aunt and cousin was swift and absolute. Their social ruin was complete before the orchestra even dared to strike up the next waltz. They had gambled everything on public shame and had lost spectacularly, exposed as malicious and grasping. Alistair led me from the ballroom, away from the whispers and stares, out onto a quiet stone terrace that overlooked the vast sleeping gardens of his London house. The cool night air was a relief. The distant sounds of the party faded, replaced by the gentle rustle of leaves. He turned me to face him, his hands framing my face, his thumbs gently stroking my cheeks. His grey eyes, so often guarded and severe, were filled with a light I had never seen before, a mixture of fierce pride and overwhelming tenderness. "You did not need me to rescue you in there," he said softly. "You rescued yourself." "You taught me I was worth rescuing," I replied, my voice thick with emotion. He leaned down, and the world dissolved. His kiss was not the tentative, hesitant thing I might have imagined. It was a kiss of profound certainty, of promises made and futures claimed. It was slow and deep and shaking, a complete and total communication of everything that had remained unspoken between us. The longing, the recognition, the relief. It was the final, perfect resolution, the sealing of a bond forged not in the glittering ballrooms of London, but in the quiet spaces, a draughty corner, a dusty library, a cold cottage made warm by a secret kindness. It was the kiss of a man who had come home. 3 months later, I was the Duchess of Blackwood. We were married in the small ancient chapel on his estate, a simple ceremony, attended by only a few close friends and a quietly beaming Amelia. Our new life was a tapestry woven from the threads of peace and mutual respect. The vast echoing halls of Blackwood Castle, which I had feared would be overwhelming, became a sanctuary under his guidance. He showed me its secrets, not as a master showing off his possessions, but as a partner sharing a beloved world. The grand library, larger than any I had ever dreamed of, became the heart of our home. We spent our evenings there, reading by the fire, the comfortable silence between us as meaningful as any conversation. Mrs. Gable, his formidable, long-serving housekeeper, had initially regarded me with a wary, assessing eye. I understood. She had loved the first Duchess and was fiercely protective of the master she had seen consumed by grief. I did not try to win her over with false charm. I simply was myself. I learned the names of the staff, took an interest in the running of the household, and deferred to her experience. One afternoon, she found me in the library, attempting to mend a small tear in one of Alistair's old riding jackets. She watched me for a moment, then came forward and took the jacket from my hands. "Allow me, Your Grace," she said, her voice softer than I had ever heard it. "The master has not been so at ease in this house for many years. It is good to hear laughter in these halls again." It was her benediction, a quiet signal of acceptance that meant more to me than the approval of all of London society. Amelia, freed from the crushing weight of our family's ambition, blossomed. Without the pressure to be a commodity, her natural warmth and kindness shone through. She soon made a happy and suitable match with a neighbouring country gentleman, a man who loved her for her sweet nature, not her potential connections. Her letters to me were filled with a simple, genuine joy that had been absent for so long. One evening, as Alistair and I sat by the fire, I reached into the pocket of my dress and drew out the small wooden horse he had given me all those months ago. I had carried it with me every day. I held it in the palm of my hand, its wood warmed by my touch, and traced its simple, elegant lines. He saw it and smiled, a true, unguarded smile that still had the power to take my breath away. He covered my hand with his own, enclosing the small token between our palms. Looking at him, at the love and peace in his face, I thought of the long, winding path that had led me to this moment. I had started as a shadow, an overlooked footnote in my own family's story, a girl to be seated near the servants. It seemed a lifetime ago. I had learnt that being seen, truly and completely, by one person could change the fabric of your world. It could take the discarded stone and reveal it to be a jewel. Home, I realised, was not a castle or an estate. It was not a place at all. It was the profound, unshakable certainty of being known and loved just as you are.